Госпожа председатель.
Madam President, we have convened an urgent meeting of the Security Council in connection with the missile attack carried out by the armed forces of Ukraine on the town of Lisichansk on Saturday, February 3rd. As a result of the attack, the two-story building of a cafe and bakery was almost fully destroyed, and the ceilings between the floors collapsed. Approximately 40 people were buried under the rubble. 28 people died, including a pregnant woman and her 5-year-old child. 4 of the injured are still in very serious condition. We have no doubt that the target and the timing of the attack were not chosen by chance. The city is located close to the line of contact between the two sides and is regularly shelled using a variety of weapons. There are a few recreational facilities there. The neo-Nazis deliberately waited until families were out for a walk on their day off and cynically attacked what is practically the only place of leisure in Lisichansk. The strike was carried out using high-power explosive, high-precision weapons, presumably HIMARS MLRS rockets were used. The investigative committee of the Russian Federation has already seized fragments of ammunition from the site of the attack and is verifying their provenance. Today, we are certain to hear claims that Russia convenes the Council too often on aspects of the Ukrainian crisis. But it is not us coming up with reasons for these meetings. It is the Ukrainian militants who have become so savage and brazen that they are committing terrorist acts nearly every week, shelling civilian infrastructure and killing civilians on Russian territory. This is the 4th terrorist attack of this kind in the past month and a half. The actions of the Kiev regime are astonishing in their cruelty and their sophisticated hatred. The shelling in Belgorod, the 2 strikes on Donetsk, and now the one in the city of Lisichansk took place on weekends and public holidays in areas where civilians congregate in large numbers. And the timing of the strike invariably coincided with peak numbers of visitors at a particular site. In none of the cases was there any military infrastructure nearby. The fact that the junta's Kiev has finally cast off its masks and chosen the path of terrorism is evidenced not only by the frank statements of its ringleaders, but also by the actions that they are taking. For example, yesterday we learned that Georgian border guards confiscated a batch of explosives disguised as car batteries and intended for terrorist attacks in Voronezh and possibly Tbilisi. This failed action, which inter alia was aimed at blaming Georgia for everything, is the responsibility of a member of parliament from Zelensky's party. And it is these projects and the style of the most egregious ISIL terrorists that are being funded by Western aid for Ukraine. The Ukrainian armed forces undoubtedly have a sense of impunity and all-permissiveness. What's more, they're aware of the unconditional support from Washington, London, and Brussels, who do not care about the killing of civilians, the destruction of families and people's lives and futures. In its blind hatred for our country and its desire to somehow weaken Russia, the West is prepared to pay with other people's lives and to renounce universal norms of morality. One hopes that the ordinary citizens of the United States and the European Union who live under brutal censorship and propaganda will hear the whole truth about Kiev's atrocities and the complicity of their own governments in them. They should know that the lethal weapons regularly being sent to Ukraine are used to commit terrorist acts against innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure in violation of international humanitarian law. If someone tries to argue that Western countries have nothing to do with this because it is Kiev that chooses its own targets for its strikes, they should be reminded of the confession made by Mr. Skibitsky, a representative of the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine. In August 2022, he let slip that in order to use HIMARS systems, Kiev needs to agree on the target with Washington ahead of time. So that's clear who was an accomplice to the crime committed in Lisichansk. And not just this crime, but dozens, if not hundreds, of others involving Western weapons. Madam President, among such recent heinous crimes of the Banderite junta is the January 24th premeditated attack on the Russian military transport aircraft Il-76 of the Russian Armed Forces, which was carrying 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war for an agreed exchange. As a result of this attack, 74 people were killed, including the Russian crew, military, police officers, and all the prisoners of war. I recall that the Kiev regime was perfectly aware of the planned exchange, and it was duly informed about the mode of transportation being used and the route by which the prisoners would be transported. Yet almost immediately after the plane crash, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine triumphantly confirmed its involvement, thus de facto recognizing that the aircraft had been shot down by the valiant Ukrainian military on purpose. Yet as soon as the public learned that the plane was transporting captured Ukrainian soldiers to their place of exchange, President Zelensky's office radically changed its talking points and began to cowardly deny any involvement of Ukraine in the disaster. It is telling that President Zelensky initially stated the need for an international investigation into the deaths of those aboard the aircraft. However, as more and more evidence of the Ukrainian armed forces' involvement emerged, the Kiev regime abandoned this demand as it realized that involving unbiased international experts in the investigation could confirm its guilt and fully destroy Ukraine's already tarnished reputation. Since the meeting we requested on January 25th, the Russian investigation has progressed. We have completed the decoding of the flight data recorder and the voice recorder. We also analyzed washes from fragments of hulls and mechanisms from the crash site and identified traces of hexogen with impurities containing up to 10% of octogenes, which is typical for foreign-made explosives. Today, we possess irrefutable evidence that a Patriot surface-to-air missile was used to carry out the strike, which leaves no doubt that Washington is a direct accomplice in this crime as well. The State Department has not commented on this information in any way. Instead, it has hypocritically suggested that Kiev's representatives do so. More than 670 fragments of victims' bodies, as well as partially preserved personal documents, were found and collected near the crash site. As a result of the genetic tests that were carried out, we can unequivocally confirm the identity of the 6 crew members, 3 military police officers, and 65 Ukrainian servicemen who died when the plane crashed. The investigation had the genetic data of all the Ukrainian soldiers at its disposal, and we are prepared to share the outcome of our national investigation with any interested international organizations. We have already circulated a letter to this effect to the United Nations. The evidence of the Ukraine armed forces' involvement in this terrorist attack on the Il-76 is so irrefutable that even the West cannot ignore it. An unnamed French official recently told the Associated Press that the French military believes that the plane was shot down by a Patriot system from a distance of about 50 kilometers. We once again call on the members of the Security Council and the leadership of the United Nations to decisively condemn the rocket attack on Lisichansk, as well as all other terrorist acts committed by the Kiev regime. The Banderite junta sees your silence as a carte blanche to commit ever more crimes. For our part, we reaffirm that all those involved in these crimes, including their organizers and the executors, will be identified and held accountable. We also reaffirm that all the objectives set for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, as well as the other goals set for the special military operation, will be achieved, whether by diplomatic or military means. Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Today, we heard cynical statements along the lines of, we would not be sitting here if Russia hadn't started this war. No, ladies and gentlemen, if we had not started our special military operation, tragedies like the one in Lisichansk would keep happening every day, which is exactly what was happening practically every day for 8 years up until 2022. Only you weren't noticing it back then, and we came to put an end to that war, and we most definitely will. To my UK colleague, I wish to say the following. It is your former Prime Minister Boris Johnson who in April 2022 came to Kiev in a rush when the agreement between Russia and Ukraine was practically ready and just had to be finalized. He rushed to Kiev and told his puppets in Kiev to continue the war against Russia. So it was your former Prime Minister Boris Johnson who is complicit in the crimes of the Kiev regime and who is responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of young Ukrainians on the battlefield, whereas their lives could have been spared if that agreement had been signed, if signing it had not been prohibited by your UK and US colleagues. To respond to the emotional statement made by the permanent representative of France, I would like to stress that deaths are always a tragedy. However, we are surprised by the cynical position of French colleagues when it comes to dividing civilians into those whose deaths and killings they condemn and those whose extermination they ignore. In being outraged by the deaths of their compatriots, the French representatives cynically ignore the fact that the weapons they ship is intentionally being used by the Kiev regime to kill civilians in Russian cities. Paris even tried to justify such crimes with the right to self-defense, essentially justifying acts of terrorism. We see the persistence with which French leadership refuses to recognize the fateful role that Paris, along with other Western capitals, played in 2014 when the crisis was erupting. They condone the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev, which for 8 years was killing its own civilians, its own citizens in Donbass. France, whose former president admitted that the Minsk agreement were not meant to be implemented. Rather, they were just meant to create a pause in order for Kiev to rearm itself. So what can one say of the contribution that France is making today when it comes to maintaining the criminal ban in Kiev, including supplying lethal weapons to Kiev and training Ukrainian soldiers? We have repeatedly said that France's growing involvement in the Ukraine conflict is not only drawing it out and leading to its further escalation, but it is threatening the lives of French citizens who, imbued with anti-Russian propaganda, are, with the tacit agreement of authorities, are going to the front lines to volunteer as mercenaries in the war. I hope that what has taken place will make the French public consider how justified the counterproductive and dangerous line its leadership is taking is in the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you.